Be in today for the first Sunday. And if you need a Bible, Benny's got some Bibles there. And in today's message, of course, I usually on the 4th of July or Thanksgiving, I talk about our founding fathers. I talk about the godly heritage that God has given and the reason why America exists in the first place. And today I'm going to take it in a little different direction. What I want us to do is, and I haven't done this in a while, I want us to take a look kind of at the big picture of where we are, not only as a country, but as a world and a planet, where we're at in Bible prophecy, in the end times, in the end days, and also where America fits in the scheme of those things and God's plans and purposes for this nation. And so the first thing that we're going to look at is we're going to look at the signs. And so the first thing, and signs, as you know, is something that is to alert us. It's something that's supposed to stand out and speak to us, to show us direction. It's not something supposed to be hidden. It's something supposed to be so obvious that we can't miss it. Now, when they started the Interstate Highway Program in the 1950s, one of the big things that they had to figure out was they were going to have uniform signs throughout the entire country. And the guy who was in charge of the project decided that we were going to have blue signs with white print. And everybody thought he was crazy. Well, he wasn't crazy. He was colorblind. I mean, he couldn't see, and so they overrode him, even though he was in charge. And they came out, of course, as you know, the green signs with the white print. I mean, can you imagine? You could have gotten Stevie Wonder to pick out better colors than the guy. You're colorblind. But so that's been the uniform. And of course, in China, if you happen to go over there, it's going to look very similar to the United States because they steal all our ideas. And that's exactly the way they did it. Well, the sign is for us to see. It's to be able to see what is coming, to give us information about that. And there's two signs that we have, big signs, that the Lord told us about. In a letter A, we're going to look at the technology and evil would increase in the last days. Those are two of the big signs that we see. And Carlos, if you could put up Daniel 12:4, that's the next slide. Should be on there. Now, Daniel gave us, he was talking about the end times, and he said this about the technology. He says, but you, Daniel, roll up and seal the words of this scroll until when? The times of the end. He said, many will go here and there and increase knowledge. That knowledge would greatly increase in the last days. And of course, with technology. Now, it's mind-blowing to me to think about just the unbelievable amount of change that has taken place not only in our lifetime, but over the last century or so. My grandmother, when she was born, she was literally born at the turn of the 20th century in the horse and buggy age. I mean, she was born before Henry Ford invented the Model T. And so from that time, and in I think it was 1911 is when the Wright brothers took off from Kitty Hawk, and they made a couple hundred yards in the air. I mean, basically it was a glider with a lawnmower engine on it. And, that was the first airplane ride back then. Now imagine that, and fast forwarding 45 years from the time that my grandmother was born, before the Wright brothers, before Henry Ford, going from that to the nuclear atomic age with the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Could you imagine? And from that time, if you just went less than 69 years, you went from Henry Ford, the Wright brothers, to Neil Armstrong, putting the first man on the moon. A glider with a lawnmower engine to putting a man on the moon. You know, and all the technology, even from the time that we were born. The thing that really gets me now is the phones with those map apps that you put on there, and you literally, you put in the address, and you're driving along, and GPS knows exactly where you're at within 50 feet or less of the roads and everything else, and it's just amazing that it gives you step-by-step direction. Well, the technology that has taken off, and I want to push this in a certain direction here as we look at the end times, because so many of the things from the book of Revelation and end time prophecy could not occur without massive technological breakthroughs. A true one world government, a one world currency, electronic currency, or moving to that cashless society that we're moving towards. And let me kind of give you a picture. Now, and this is how it works as you read the Bible, how God works with man, and just give you an idea and a picture of how God is working in our lives, in human history, through the events that take place. You remember the story about Caesar Augustus in Luke chapter 2, and he decides that we should have a census of the entire known world, so he calls it. He had no idea when he called that census at that exact time, and people are moving from place to place. And of course, Mary and Joseph went from Nazareth to Bethlehem in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So it had to happen at a very time, very hour, so that when Mary gets to Bethlehem, she is great with child. She had no preparation. She had no support group as she's going. So she's forced at a specific time. And of course, there she ends up having a baby in the manger. Caesar Augustus had no idea that he was fulfilling biblical prophecy, but it was happening in so many prophecies that were taking place. Well, the same thing is happening in these days. In the 1960s, they came up with this acronym, MAD. It wasn't Mothers Against Drunk Driving. This was called Mutually Assured Destruction. And one of the things that they had, the idea, because in the 60s, this was just about 15 or 20 years at the end of World War II. It's almost about the same time that we go back to 9/11. So it's very fresh in the memory and the minds, especially of the leaders of that day. And so they came up with a mutually assured destruction for finances, which would bring all the world banks, bring all the global governments or markets together, the world economies, so that if one fell, then they would all fall. And so the idea and the theory is that if we're all tied together, then one nation wouldn't try and invade and destroy another nation, because all the other nations would see, hey, it's going to ruin our economies, it's going to ruin our lives, and so they would all come against, and they would in this way try to avert a third world war. Well, and you see that like with Greece and Cyprus, not too long ago when they got ready to go bankrupt. What happened? They got bailed out, because if Greece would have defaulted on its loan, it would have dominoed around the world. They thought the whole world economy would collapse on that. You have that a domino effect. Do you remember 2008? George Bush, in the last days of his presidency, he came on and he told us it was an amazing thing. He said, I was just informed that if we don't have this $1 trillion bailout, the whole world is going to melt down on my watch. Whew. So they had the TARP bailout, and they put in $1 trillion because And I'm listening to this, and I had no idea. In 24 hours, the whole world market's going to melt down. All of these things are going to take place. And so they bailed everything out, because if the United States collapsed, everything would collapse. And since those days, has the debt increased or decreased? I mean, from 7 to 8 to $9 trillion. We'll be north of $20 trillion before the end of this administration. So the debt has increased, it has not decreased. The overall world economy situation has gotten worse. It hasn't gotten better. And of course, this past week with Brexit, the Britons deciding to unplug from the European Union is an example of how that domino effect could occur and to shuffle world markets. And so what if, here's the question, we experience one of the largest global meltdowns in human history? What do you think would happen? And let me give you a little perspective on what has happened in the past with nations. Back in the 1700s, when the American Revolution was going on, well, something was going on in France. They were having the French Revolution. And you remember the famous quote by Marie Antoinette. You know, the people were starving. They had no food. And she said, well, let them eat cake. And there was a Far Side cartoon that I read, and it was a picture of Marie Antoinette going to the gallows, and she's saying, I said, let them eat cake and ice cream. I said, cake and ice cream, as she's going there, hoping that would avert a situation. I guess it wasn't as funny to you as it was to me. But anyhow, that created the reign of terror. I mean, it was just chaos in France because of the economy, because of the lack of food that was there. And then in 1907, during Russia, you had the Bolshevik Revolution, you had the communist takeover from the czars, and of course that gave us Stalin and the Soviet Union and all the chaos in there and all the things that are aftermath of that. The 1930s, what did we have? We had the same problem in Germany and the Weimar Republic, where literally the inflation was so bad, bread could be $10 in the morning. You'd need a wheelbarrow in the afternoon. Bread would be $100. I mean, the money was absolutely worthless, and that gave rise to, of course, the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler, the Third Reich, and all the problems that came out of that. And so, if we imagine if you had this global meltdown and the rise of a global leader, not just one country, but all the countries on the face of the earth, all connected, we would have a rise of a world leader who I believe would be the Antichrist. And so you think about that. If we tied that with the technology into Matthew 24:22, what Jesus said, he said, we got the next slide after that? Okay. He said, if those days had not been cut short, talking about the evil in the world, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Now I want you to think about that and what he just said there. See those two words? It says that no one would survive. How in the world could things get so bad that no one on planet Earth could survive? I mean, when the Babylonians took over the known world and conquered the known world, of course, there were survivors from those countries, and the Babylonians were going to survive. When Hitler was trying to purge the whole world with the Aryan race, he was planning to survive, and there would be other people that might survive. But he's saying it is going to be so bad that no one would survive. How would that happen? And of course, we know with nuclear bombs, with chemical warfare, we could be in a situation where what? No one would be able to survive. And Jesus said, if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. And if you want to understand what's behind the global jihad, the global caliphate, which ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Iran, and the Islamic militants believe in, when the world is on fire, it will give rise, they believe, to the 12th Imam or the hidden Imam. And from the Quran, he is the same description as the Antichrist in the Bible. Now, I was listening to Fox News this week, and I've never heard one of the senators had said, and I'd never heard somebody say this in politics in this way, but he was talking about this very thing, and he was talking about the terrorists believe that they are fulfilling Islamic prophecies, that they are ushering in a world of chaos on fire. Why? So that their Messiah is going to come in and create peace all over the earth. That is what they are doing. That is what they're behind. And if you want to turn in your Bibles, I want us to look at Revelation, the 13th chapter, and kind of tie this together. So we got all of this in the backdrop of our mind. And look at verse 2 in chapter 13. And it says that the dragon will give the beast his power and his throne and great authority. Now let's just stop there for a second. You need to understand something about the enemy and about Satan. What Satan does, he's never had an original thought of his own. So he takes, kind of like the Chinese, they take all of our technology and information and make it their own. Well, that's what the enemy does. Okay, we have the Holy Trinity. We have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So what does Satan have? He has his unholy Trinity. You have the devil, you have the beast, and you have the Antichrist. And so the dragon here is Satan himself. The beast is the Antichrist. They're actually known as the two beasts, but one is the Antichrist and the other is the other beast. So the dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but that fatal wound had been healed. Now let's just stop there for a second. What is the enemy doing? Here is this Antichrist, and something happens to him. He has a fatal wound in his head, and he dies, and he is resurrected, just like Jesus Christ was resurrected on the third day. It is a false miracle to deceive the whole world. So he has this fatal wound, the Bible says, and he was healed. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. In what other time and what other generation could the whole world follow one man if it wasn't today for the technology and the ability to trace and to follow everyone on planet Earth? And so they followed the beast. Men worshiped. Underline that word, worshiped. That is absolutely key to understanding where we are today in the end times. Men worshiped who? The dragon, Satan, because he had given authority to the beast. Let's go down to verse 8. All inhabitants of the earth will worship. What are they going to do? They are going to worship the beast. All whose names have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. So get this. They're going to worship the dragon, Satan. They're going to worship the beast, the Antichrist. Who do we worship? We worship God the Father. Who else do we worship? His Son, Jesus Christ. So Satan gets worshiped, and the Antichrist also gets worshiped. Now go down to verse 16. It says, he also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive the mark on his right hand and on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which the name of the beast, or the number of his name. And of course, that number is 666. Now think about that. You will be giving a choice at some point in the future. If it's pre or post rapture, we don't know. But at some point, when the whole world collapses, this great world leader arises, and he's able to fix all the problems. Now all of a sudden, everybody has to worship him. Well, I'm not going to worship him. Well, if you don't worship him, and you don't take the sign on your hand or your forehead, you cannot buy or sell. You can't go to Publix and buy food. You can't buy a house. You have a business, you can't sell your products. You're going to be living under a bridge. How could that be possible that every inhabitant of the world, and of course we know with all the technology today, what seemed to be absolutely impossible just a generation or two ago is not only possible, it's a reality that is waiting to happen. But think about the other thing that we're looking at, the Islamic Caliphate. What is all of this terrorism really about? One word. Worship, isn't it? It's all about worship. If you don't worship their God and follow him, then like the 21 Christians who had their heads cut off, like the people who were burned in the fire, what was that all about? It is an example to the rest of the world that if you don't follow our God, if you don't observe Sharia law, and the Muslims are fighting with the Muslims because some of them aren't radical enough for the other ones. But imagine that we're coming to a place where people will kill you if you're not willing to worship their God their way. Do you see that happening? When we were kids, not even kids, you don't have to go much before 9/11 to realize that terrorism, as we know it today, and how many terrorist plots have we had in the last 2 weeks? 2 or 3, maybe 4. You can't even keep count of it that's taken place. And all of this is happening. It's building itself up to a climax. Now, and I'm kind of laying the foundation. First of all, we need to see the signs before we see the sovereignty, because this stuff can give you the heebie-jeebies if you don't really understand what's going on, and you don't understand the spiritual powers that are taking place underneath. Let's look at letter B. There's another huge sign. While all of this is going on, the Bible describes in detail a super sign of the end times. And that is Israel is going to be the super sign. Do we have Matthew 24:32 on there? Okay, go back. That's okay. Let me just go ahead and read it to you. Now, Jesus gives us a picture of what it is like in the last days as it regards to Israel. It's a very clear picture, and it's about the fig tree. Now, Jesus in Matthew 24, he's talking about all the end times and all the things that are going to take place, and as he gets to his final point about this, he uses an illustration, a word picture, like we're talking about with the sheep and the shepherd and talking about the body of Christ. Well, he uses the fig tree. And he said this, "Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near." And he says, "Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door." And so he's talking about Israel. The fig tree goes through a season where it is dormant, where it looks dead. Mark Twain in the 1880s was going through Israel, the area of Palestine. He said it was the most barren, desolate place he had ever seen, even more desolate than the deserts that he has seen. And so it was a completely desolate. But Israel has now been like that tree that shoots forth its leaves and begins to grow. Now I want to look at 10 prophecies just very quickly about Israel and about what God said was going to take place. If we could go back to that first slide. And before we actually get into that, you can go to the first slide. Yeah, that one. Thank you. Let me give you a picture of how these things take place. Now, when Israel became a nation the first time, during the time of Moses, what was happening while they were in Egypt? Pharaoh decided that he needed population control, so he took all the male babies, he threw them into the Nile River. Now, there were about 2 to 3 million Jewish people, Hebrews at that time, and this policy could have gone on for decades. Moses happened to be born at the very time that this policy was instituted. And do you know why? Because the devil knew that a savior for Israel was coming. And so he tried to kill all the babies. Now, Moses doesn't deliver Israel until he's 80 years of age. So 80 years have passed with all of this carnage going on year after year after year for this population control. And of course, you know the story there. When Jesus comes, what happens? King Herod decides that he's going to kill all the baby boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity to try and destroy the Messiah. How did he know? The devil knew that Jesus was to be born, and he was trying to destroy the Messiah. So again, we have death with Moses, we have death with Jesus. And at the birth of Israel in 1948, what happened to precede that? You had World War II, you had the Holocaust, and you had the 6 million Jews that were killed. Are we seeing a pattern? Are we seeing a similarity? And what did they say was the reason to give Israel a nation state of its own? They said this Holocaust is so bad that the Jewish people need their own homeland, so this will never happen again. They pointed exactly back to the concentration camp and to the Holocaust as the reason for the birth of Israel again. And what they didn't know, what the United Nations didn't know, like Caesar Augustus didn't know, and like so many world leaders didn't know, that they were fulfilling biblical prophecy without even knowing it. That's how sovereign God is. So let's look at a few of these. The first one, Israel would be a nation in a day. In Isaiah 66:8, it says, "Who has ever heard of such a thing? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children. No other nation on earth has ever been born in a single day, in a single moment." And you say, well, what's tomorrow?
July 4th.
July 4th, all right. And what does that celebrate? Independence Day. The birth of our nation, right? Okay. Not really, okay? Because what happened on July 4th, 1776? They signed the Declaration of Independence. Did we become the United States of America that day? No, we were still the 13 colonies. We had to send it over to England. And King George said, "Screw you, I'm not doing that." And so he sends his army. I'm paraphrasing, you know what I'm saying. And so we had the Revolutionary War. So at the end of the Revolutionary War, did we become a nation? No, not exactly. We had to have our Constitution. So they get their Constitutional Convention together, and then did we become a nation? No, we had the Articles of Confederation, and that didn't work. So they went back to the drawing board, and they had so you see the process. When did America actually become a nation? Well, it was a process, and we celebrate July 4th as that day of celebrating our nation's birth. That's okay. But for Israel, it happened on May 14th, coming at 12 midnight to May 15th. At that moment, they became a nation. In fulfillment of the prophecy in Isaiah 66:8. Israel, the second one, would rebuild its ancient ruins. Ezekiel 36:10. And you can read from Ezekiel 36, 37, 38, 39, all of these prophecies about the nation of Israel that would be fulfilled. And who is the God of Israel? It's the God of this Bible. And he says, I'm going to show you something. And so when you see it, you know that it's no accident. The next one, Israel would be repopulated. And of course, it was desolate, it was barren, but he brought them from the north, the south, the east, and the west. And there's a story behind every one of these prophecies. Israel would be the Garden of Eden. And it says in Ezekiel 36:35, the land that was laid waste has become like the Garden of Eden. Now, when we were in Israel last year, we're in Tel Aviv. It was amazing. We're there at the Hall of Justice, and we're seeing these pictures. Tel Aviv, it's the largest metropolitan city in all of Israel. The only airport in Israel is Tel Aviv. Hundreds of thousands of people. And the pictures before Tel Aviv was built, it was all sand dunes. 100% sand dunes. It's like going out in the middle of nowhere and building a city. You know, kind of like, out in Nevada, where they just kind of built the whole Sin City there, that idea. And so they built this whole city out of sand dunes. And yet it was repopulated. And Israel today, because of their technology, because of their drip irrigation system, they've literally turned the desert into a garden. They are the largest exporters of flowers and fruit out of the Middle East. That is Israel. It's unbelievable. And what did God say? Israel would be like the Garden of Eden. Israel would be extremely prosperous. Ezekiel 36:11. They have more patents, more Nobel Prize winners. They are the Silicon Valley of the Middle East. I mean, the prosperity in Israel is unparalleled with any other nation in the Middle East and most any other nation in the world. Let's look at number 6, is that he would restore the ancient language. Zephaniah 3:9. Now, it says this, it says, for then will I turn the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. Now, this is something that you may not know, is that in Jesus' day, 2,000 years ago, they did not speak Hebrew as the primary language because they had been in captivity for so long. Most of the common people spoke Aramaic. Only the priests and the Pharisees knew Hebrew. Well, there was a guy back at the turn of the 1800s, going into the 19th, 20th century. His name was Eleazar ben Yehuda, and he moved to Israel. I'm just giving you the Reader's Digest version, but he moved to Israel. He wrote the Hebrew lexicon. He taught his family. He taught his neighbors. He taught his friends. And in 1948, the official language when they became a nation was Hebrew. It's in their magazines. It's in their newspapers. It's on their telecast. Everybody speaks Hebrew today, where most of them didn't speak Hebrew in Jesus' day. God restored the language. Israel, now 7 through 10, are prophecies that are going to come true. Israel will rebuild Solomon's temple. In 1967, during the 6-day war, now imagine that. You talk about a miraculous war. In 1967, for the third time, the Arab countries gathered together and they were going to push, literally, Israel into the sea. They didn't have this vast army to protect themselves. How in the world could Israel defend themselves? Do you know that the Palestinian refugees, the Arabs told the Palestinians, you guys get out. We're going to kill every man, woman, child, baby, get rid of all the Jews, and then you can go back and take over the cities. That was the plan. God so helped Israel that in 6 days they quadrupled their landmass. The Soviet leader called the President of the United States and said, you call Israel off or we're going to get involved. And so on the 6th day, they stopped. After they quadrupled their landmass, they devastated all of those Arab countries that attacked them. And they took over Jerusalem. And on the 7th day, it just so happened that it was a Sabbath and they rested. Is that a miracle or is that a miracle from God? And one of the men who was in Jerusalem that they took over during the 6-day war, God spoke to him and said, you need to start making plans to rebuild Solomon's temple. And for the last 50 years plus, the Temple Mount project was born. And when we were in Israel, we saw all the stuff. They've got all the artifacts ready. They've got the priests ready. They've got the Sanhedrin has been all of this stuff is ready to rebuild Solomon's temple. Do you think that is going to happen in the future? And the answer is absolutely. Now, the Antichrist is going to defile the Holy of Holies. The Antichrist cannot defile the Holy of Holies if there is no temple. So you have the temple, you have the Holy of Holies, and then the Antichrist will come and defile it. Russia, Iran, and a coalition is going to attack Israel. And you know what's going on. Maybe you don't know what's going on with the Soviet Union, with Iran. And Iran is the one that keeps saying that they're going to, wipe out Israel, knock them off the map, and a whole coalition. God is going to, in Ezekiel 39, absolutely devastate those countries. And 10, I just throw it in for good measure, that Christ will rule and reign for 1,000 years at the end. And let me tell you something else about this Bible that you may not know. Most of us see it as a history book of things that took place in the past. Well, that is true, but what you may not know, because the Bible talks about man's beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, but it goes all the way through human history. It goes to the times that we're living in today. 33% of all the scriptures is Bible prophecy, and it goes literally to the end, to where Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. It tells us how the history begins. It's telling us exactly how it ends and everything else in between. These 10 prophecies, along with hundreds of others, could not have been fulfilled by some man, by some person that was trying to make it up, or men. It's impossible to foretell. These prophecies are 2,500 years old, going back to the Babylonian Empire. So this is what we have in the signs of the last days. We live in a time that no other people on history has lived. All right, so let's look at the sovereignty. And this is the application portion. You need application for the information that you have. How do we thrive in this environment and not faint? Because Jesus has already said that the people of this world are going to faint because of the apprehension of the days that are coming. Some of us in this room might be freaked out as we read the news, as we look at all the things that are happening, as we're, what happened in Orlando and safety for ourselves and everything else. Here is the point. Sovereignty. Number 2, God is sovereign over all the nations. And this is what God said in Amos 3:8. He says, surely the sovereign Lord does nothing without revealing his plans to his servants, the prophets. This is what God said. Before I do anything in the future, I'm going to tell you ahead of time so that you will know what I'm going to do. And when I do it, then you will know that it was I who did it. So he said, surely the sovereign Lord does nothing without revealing his plans to his servants, the prophets. Now, Jesus was talking to his disciples in John 13:19, and he was talking about him being betrayed and crucified. And this is what he said. He said, I am telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am he. So he tells them, and he says, the reason I'm telling you this is so that when it happens, you will know. God is telling us our future today. And as we see it happen, we shall also know that it is God. It's not an accident that's taking us by surprise. We should not be caught by surprise. So instead of being panicked or fearful or overwhelmed, that we would have peace. But our problem is I think we fall into the same trap as Jesus' disciples did. When Jesus told them plainly, but they did not understand. They didn't know what he was talking about. Now, Jesus is talking to his disciples. I'm going to read this to you. I want you to listen closely and tell me if you understand what Jesus is saying to his disciples. Can you do that? Okay, listen up. Jesus took the 12 aside. He's giving them a private conversation. He's about ready to tell them some important information. He says, we are going to Jerusalem, and everything that was written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He will be handed over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, insult him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. On the third days, he will rise again. Now, what part of that do you not understand? Does everybody get it? Does everybody understand what Jesus said? Well, listen to verse 34. The disciples did not understand any of this. Its meaning was hidden from them, and they did not know what he was talking about. And you say, how could that possibly be? He was so plain. He was so direct. He was so forthcoming. The reason, I believe, was because they had already had preconceived ideas that Jesus wasn't going anywhere, that he was going to rule and reign on earth. They were going to follow him and be, on thrones themselves and rule and reign with him. And so all of this stuff about him dying, being flogged, being killed, all of that stuff, they didn't understand that. Listen, I believe we're the same way. We don't quite fully get the reality of the days that we're living in. And so while we see the world melting down, we may become just as fearful, just as panicked as the disciples did, because we're not preparing for that, for those realities. As we see them come to pass, instead of being fearful, we should be in awe that God is in control, that God is sovereign, that God is the one who has told us in advance what was going to take place. Do we have Romans 13:1 up there? I want to tie America in here. It says in Romans 13:1, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. No authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. There's never been a country that's ever been raised that God has not allowed to come to power, to come to fruition. Now, America, I believe, plays two dramatic roles in end-time prophecy. And the first role that it plays, not mentioned in the Bible, but I believe it is winding down, that we were created to be a city on a hill, that we were to shine the light of the gospel all around the world. That was the purpose of God founding the United States of America. If you have your highlight sheets, and I don't know, here's mine. Look inside. Here's a great quote from one of our presidents, John Adams. Listen to what he says. He says, suppose a nation in some distant region should take the Bible for their only law book. What an incredible idea. And every member should regulate his conduct by the precepts they're exhibited. What a utopia. What a paradise would be that region would be. That was one of our presidents. That was one of our founding fathers who said if we took the Bible and lived by it, we would create a utopia. We would create a paradise here on earth. Now, does that sound like some agnostic? Does that sound like some person that didn't know God, believe God? There are hundreds of quotes just like that from our founding fathers. They believed that they were here for a mission to spread the gospel around the world. And of course, today, we're more known for the world's #1 exporter of pornography and Hollywood decadence and all the things that are coming out of America today. They're actually sending missionaries to the United States. I mean, we have so turned away from. Could you imagine if somebody wrote that today and tried to convince the American people that we should live by that? I mean, he would never get to first base. They would think he was crazy. They would think he was some right-wing, nut. So the second thing is that there is a vacuum that is created by the absence of America in end-time prophecy. The Bible does not specifically mention America in end-time prophecy, which is almost impossible because we're, one of the world's superpowers in this day. Now, I kind of say that's true and maybe not true because we could be symbolically Babylon the Great in the book of Revelation. Now, that is no consolation prize because Babylon is going to be destroyed in 1 hour. But everything that it says about Babylon fits America to a T. If it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it's a good chance that it's a duck. Well, it says of Babylon the Great, that was a great power in the end time, in 1 hour would be destroyed. Now think about that in the light of the technology and the wickedness that we talked about earlier. There's never been a time in human history that something like that could have ever happened. When the Babylonians attacked Israel and destroyed Jerusalem, if they had their entire army, they couldn't have done it in a day or a week or a month. They took months and months to knock down those walls, to get the battering rams and everything else. Could that possibly happen today? Nuclear weapons, biological, chemical warfare. A nation could be destroyed in an hour in today's life that we live in. Does that make sense? And so the things that the Bible was talking about was saying that stuff could have never taken place when it was written 2,000 years ago. But